Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Meghna, and I'm really excited to be your host for today's Awaken Talk along with Rohit. Welcome and thank you for joining us from literally across the globe. The purpose of these talks is to share stories and to plant seeds for a more compassionate society while fostering our own inner transformation. We do this by holding collective conversations like these with guest speakers from different walks of life who inspire us to live in a more service way. Today, and behind each of these calls is a team of service based volunteers whose invisible work allows us to hold this space with a lot more sacredness and spaciousness. Today, our special guest speaker is Venerable Karma Lekshe Somo. In the first part of the call, Venerable Lekshe will share some insights from her deep exploration on this topic of death and dying. And in the second part of the call, we will be taking some questions. So thank you for joining us, and let us start with a minute of silence to anchor ourselves in the present moment. Thank you.
Welcome back. Thank you, Meghna, and thank you all once again for joining us. Today, as Meghna said, we are in conversation with Venerable Lekshe on the theme of death and dying. Venerable Karma Lekshe Somo is one of the most revered Buddhist nuns across the globe. And incidentally, the topic of death and dying is what attracted her to Tibetan Buddhism and in part inspired her to ordain as a nun more than 40 years ago. And sort of it has been an area of her focus for her lifelong work. She's a professor at the University of San Diego in USA, where she teaches Buddhism, world religions, as well as death and dying and social justice. She's a social activist who has pioneered monasticism for females, and she's the co-founder of Sakhyadita, which means Daughters of the Buddha, which is the foremost international association in over 45 countries for the benefit of Buddhist women. She is the founding director of the Jamyang Foundation, which supports the education of women and girls in the remote regions of Himalayas and beyond. And I could go on and on, but the best way really to understand her and the simplest way to understand her is to be in her joyful and kind presence. So we would like to start with a short clip with some spontaneous questions we asked her just a couple of days ago. And then after that, we'll hand over the stage to Venerable Lekshe for her sharing her insights with us.
The first act of kindness that comes to mind when I think of this question is an old woman up in the Himalayas in an area called Zanskar, where the people are living very close to the earth. And they have basically one set of clothes, no hot water, no electricity, none of the modern amenities. And yet, when she saw my arm that I'd been bitten by a snake, she took my arm with such incredible kindness. And she started to move her hand up and down in a healing gesture. And the compassion that came from her, she said, "Oh, now you have gotten rid of this karma from the past, and your future will be very bright." It was so lovely. It was so sweet. I'll never forget it. Since I was a small child, I wondered what happened to us after we die. And when I went to India in 1972 on an East-West centered ground, I went to study at the Tibetan library. And when I burst into the classroom, there was a small lama at the end of the room, and he was explaining exactly what happens to us after we die. And I thought, that's it, home free. And I sat at his feet for 6 years and learned everything that I could from him. That was a real pivotal moment. Oh, I think I would be sitting right here, meditating and looking out over the ocean and the land, just appreciating every moment of the day. No need to go anywhere, just go inside. Two experiences of death really moved me, but they were crushing because they were the death of my dogs. Twice I lost 2 dogs on Pacific Coast Highway to the traffic. And it was so heartbreaking for me that I think it did shape my awareness in a way that life is very short and fragile. And all of our attachments lead to suffering. So even though these were both very painful experiences, I think that they were very pivotal, very central in my growth of awareness. My prayer for the world would be that all misfortunes disappear, all illnesses be cured, all misery be turned to joy, that all beings' fears be turned to courage, that all people's anger be turned to patience, that their hatred turn to compassion, all of their ignorance turn to wisdom, and that everyone in the world shall awaken to the purity of their consciousness, the very essence of understanding. This would be my prayer. Mama Sangye Tugyune Toachikya Mahalapa Keki Sala Gurpa Shom.
Thank you, Venerable Lekshe, and it is an honor to have you here with us today. And thank you so much for blessing us with your presence and agreeing to share your wisdom and insights. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today. Can everyone hear okay?
Yes.
Sound okay? Okay, good. Well, so usually I like to start out with a sort of looking at our intention. Why are we here? Let's set our attention for this gathering, which is a very special opportunity to get together with people from around the world and to explore a topic as meaningful as death and dying. So let's sit for a minute. I'll say a short prayer in Tibetan, and then we can just sit for a moment and set our intentions. Sangye chidan soki chognam la changchu badu dagmi kyapsu chi dagi jinso gi pisunam ki dola penche sangye du parsho. We go for refuge to the awakened ones, to their teachings, and to the spiritual community. By the practice of generosity and the other perfections, may I achieve the state of perfect awakening in order to liberate all living beings from suffering. you. So I would also like to acknowledge that I am coming to you from Hawaii, and I'm standing on the land of the Hawaiian indigenous people. And I'd like to express my gratitude for the cultural treasures that they have practiced over many centuries and preserved for us to learn from. So my task was to start out with a personal story, and there's so many stories. You just heard a couple of them. The early experience of losing my two puppies was so sad. I think I was about 12 or 13, and one after the other. It really shook me up because I had no experience with death and dying. There is a tradition of more or less hiding the topic of death in the United States. It's not something that people talk about, at least maybe until the AIDS pandemic. It was really not discussed in public. And it was as if death were some sort of failure. And so people didn't want to talk about it. There was a sense that it was something very dark, something very uncontrollable, something to be avoided, if at all possible. The second story I also mentioned in that short little clip of, so since I was a young child, I always was my question, what happens to us after we die? And I would ask everyone I met, and they thought it was a little bit odd that a little kid would be asking such a question. But when I asked the ministers and other people what happens to us after we die, the answer I usually got was, well, if you're good, you go to heaven. And if you're bad, you go to hell. And I thought, well, that's a little bit too simple, isn't it? Just two options. And especially since I was a very mischievous little kid, I was a little bit worried about that answer. So I kept searching. And it wasn't until 1972 when I arrived at the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala, Himachal Pradesh, that I met this Tibetan Lama who was explaining exactly what happens to us after we die. Well, that's quite remarkable, but it really fascinated me. Not only that they had a whole cosmology that explained how we revolve around in the cycle of birth and death, but even the stages, what we can expect as we're dying and going to the next existence, as they put it. When I was in Dharamsala, I was really poor. And I got sick a lot. I remember getting hepatitis several times. And one time I was completely yellow. I went into the Tibetan doctor's office and he checked my pulse. And then I asked him, Doctor, am I going to die? And he cracked up and he said, of course you're going to die. We're all going to die. So it was an example of Tibetan humor. But then, as it turned out, you see, one day I was walking in the forest looking for some land where the nuns could stay. Previously, nuns had not had many opportunities for studying Buddhism. And so we decided that we would start some education projects where Himalayan nuns could study the Buddhist teachings. We didn't have a place. We were getting evicted from the mud huts we were living in. So I was looking for another space where we could move. And while looking around that land, apparently a Himalayan green tree viper hanging from a tree must have felt threatened and lashed out and bit me. I didn't see the snake, so I didn't know what happened. I just felt that I just felt really sick. I made it back to the monastery and collapsed. And the next day I went to the Tibetan doctor, the one I just mentioned. He was giving me acupuncture for a cracked rib that had happened in a bus crash just before. These are obstacles for nuns trying to find a home. And he's found the bite on my shoulder and he said, oh, you've been bitten by something. Raced up to get some medicine for me. It's unheard of. I'd never seen him do that before. He came back with a glass of hot water and said, drink it instantly. The Tibetans have very good medicines for poisons. So I drank the medicine. I took the medicine and eventually somehow survived that snake bite. 3 months in the hospital and a year to learn to use my arm again. So this is a reconstructed arm and I'm lucky to have it. So years later, a couple of years later, I was studying at the University of Hawaii, doing a doctorate in philosophy. Excuse me. And I was looking for a topic for my dissertation. I proposed one topic after the other, and they rejected every topic until finally I thought, light bulb, death. And that satisfied everyone. So I started exploring, the whole idea. And there are many different schools of Buddhism, and they all have different viewpoints. So it was really, really fascinating. And this is the book, Into the Jaws of Yama. And as it turned out, my advisor was getting old, and he was wondering about whether it's okay to end one's own life. It's a big issue right now, the right to terminate one's own life. So he asked me to look into this question. At first I thought, oh no, I have to write another chapter. I was really bummed out. But then when I started looking into it, the bioethical issues were really fascinating. And so this is the background of my interest in the topic. The first point to recognize, of course, is that most people are in denial about death. Intellectually, we all know that we're going to die one day, but we hope that it will happen later rather than sooner. And we sort of put off thinking about the topic. It's kind of dreary, right? And hey, life goes by, and so we want to enjoy every minute. This is the script that we're given, is, seize the day. And so eat, drink, and be merry and all that. But so facing one's own death is a really important step in the process of, I think, opening one's eyes to the topic. Now, so bringing it from the intellectual, the merely intellectual, to the practical reality of our own death, right? So I remember one time Nipun just mentioned a 10-day meditation course, and I remember being on a 10-day meditation course in Bodh Gaya, Bihar, and we weren't supposed to talk at all, right? There are about 150 people. It's a Goenka course, and we were sleeping on the rooftops and everything. And one of my friends came by and very quietly offered me some chocolate, which was a great treat in those days. And she said, "Today's my birthday, 1 year closer to death." It was quite startling. And then I realized, oh, she's got it. Oh, and she's so young, and yet she realized, usually we say, happy birthday, right? What's happy? Yeah, 1 year closer to death. So now this causes us to question, what is it that we're afraid of if we're denying death? What is it that we're afraid of? Now, a lot of young people today will, oh, I'm not afraid of death. Right. When you're 20, 25 years old, in the prime of health and, nothing to worry about, it's very easy to say this. But then as we grow older and get closer to the time of death, then it starts to sink in. And it makes us wonder, what is it that's stopping me from embracing death with courage, right? In the end, we have no choice. But there's a great difference in the way we handle death. There are many tragic events now going on in the world with the COVID crisis and with economic crisis, environmental crisis, and now military crisis, political crisis. In the sense, we're probably closer to death than we realize, especially with nuclear threat. They say we're closer to nuclear annihilation than ever before in human history right now. So it calls us to really think about the topic. We want to be prepared for the time of death so that we can face it with courage, not go out like a wimp, kind of, hey, I'm ready, So this is the idea. The Tibetan teachers that I studied with in India, I was for 15 years, they taught that if we don't meditate on death in the morning, we waste the day. If we don't meditate on death in the evening, we waste the night. So, time is of the essence, and we have a tendency to fritter away our time with silly stuff, what we're going to buy next, what we're going to eat next, who we're going to call next, what we're going to watch next. And what's it all for? In the end, these things are quite meaningless at the time of death. So I think maybe let's take a few minutes to meditate on our own impermanence. It's a kind of mindfulness exercise to get in touch with the impermanence of our body and mind. We construct our personality in our imagination. I'm like this, I'm like that, yeah? But are we really in touch with what we really are? So let's take a moment to look inside and check out. Are we permanent or impermanent? Let's pay attention and see what we find. Sitting quietly, comfortably in our body, eyes closed about 90%. Let's start at the top of the head. Slowly scan down. See what you find. Is the body permanent or impermanent? You get to your toes. Start again from the top of your head. Give another scan. See what you can find. Then check the mind also. Look inside and try to understand the nature of consciousness. Is it permanent or impermanent? When you're ready, open your eyes. What you find? Anybody find a permanent, anything permanent? Mostly the scientists will tell us that the 6 billion cells of our bodies are changing from moment to moment. And so, in fact, hard as we may search, we're going to have difficulty finding anything permanent in our body or our mind. In fact, they say we've been dying since the moment we were born, each cell disintegrating and reconstituting, disintegrating and reconstituting. So it's good to get in touch with that because it's not just a fantasy. We can actually observe it. Each one of us can observe it up close and personal, right? Now, every religion has its own answer to the question of death and dying. And I don't want to presume anything here because we'll probably have representatives from all the world's major religions and some others as well. So, and many who may not subscribe to a religion at all. So, of course, there is the materialist explanation that we come into existence and then the end, it's over, and nothing after that. So that's one point of view, right? We have the ancient Greeks who thought that after death we go through a very scary journey through the river of Styx, right? And it was something, very fearful. In fact, the word Styx means shuddering. You shudder in fear. And so there has been a lot of fear around the question of death and dying, even a loathing of death and trying to put it off for as long as we can. For example, in China, where they would try to develop elixirs of long life, immortality. A couple of emperors even died from those elixirs, unfortunately, trying to live longer, but in fact, shortening their own life. So the Buddhists have been very conscious of the question of death and dying. The Buddha talked about it a lot, very matter-of-factly. He even advised his disciples, the monks. I don't know about nuns, I don't remember a quotation, but he would advise them to go to the cremation grounds and meditate on the corpses. This is your future, he said, because that's where all of us will end up, right? Now, that's not to make us morbid, not to make us depressed. The idea is that if we understand the reality of death, it will wake us up to the preciousness of this life, every moment of life. Instead of frittering it away in trivial pursuits, we'll understand that each moment is a beautiful opportunity, an opportunity for awareness. Now, usually we're a little bit slow, we're a little bit sleepy, and we just sort of go through life in a mechanical mode. Get up, eat, go to work or school, come back, turn on the telly, and crash out. A lot of people live like this. And sometimes we do too, right? We just go into mechanical mode. But this is a great loss, actually, because life is so incredibly precious. Even if you're not a spiritual person, life is precious because of all the beauty around us. And if we don't stay and wake up to the present moment, we miss it. We miss one moment after the next, and before we know it, time's up, and we're off to whatever comes after. And we basically blew it. We lost our opportunity. Now, if we're in a spiritual mode, also, it's even more powerful to make the most of every moment, because every moment is an opportunity for awakening, for understanding, for developing wisdom, for ethical development, for generosity, the practice of patience, the practice of enthusiastic effort, the practice of contemplation, development of wisdom. There's so many precious opportunities in every moment, right? To waste them would be a tragedy. The Tibetan teachers tell the story of a beggar who went to a dumpster, like garbage container, and looked in and found this gigantic diamond. And he pulled it out of the dumpster and he looked at it, and he didn't know what it was. He didn't know what a diamond was, and so he threw it back in the dumpster. Okay, so if we waste this precious human opportunity, we're like that tragic example of the beggar who throws the diamond back in the dumpster. So this is an opportunity to see the value of each present moment of this life. And death brings that in stark perspective. As I said, in the Buddhist tradition, we're asked to meditate on death and impermanence daily, several times a day. And if we go into a retreat center in, say, Thailand or Burma or Laos or Cambodia, we're likely to be greeted by a skeleton. The skeleton hanging by the door. Well, that's a little not too subtle reminder, right? To be aware that death is definite, but the time of death is indefinite. And that the time of death, the only thing that will really be valuable are our spiritual insights, our good karma, our good deeds, the kindnesses that we've shared, and so on. So the whole idea is to see death as an opportunity rather than as a tragedy or as a failure. So now this, I'm aware that our time is limited, but what I'd like to also talk a bit about is grief and loss. So we're talking about when more than just our own death, we also need to consider the deaths of those around us. And especially in a time like the present. And I don't know about you, but I've lost many, many people from COVID. And part of it, of course, is my age group, but it's also, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and people are passing away left, right, and center. I mean, every time we turn on the news, we're presented with the statistics, how many thousands of people have died today. And it's really a wake-up call. Now, rather than getting depressed about it, though, what we can do is, again, use this as a reminder of impermanence and the importance of living every moment as a precious opportunity. So this is how death or death awareness informs our living, informs our everyday life, how we approach life, rather than letting it slip by us. We can actually awaken to the importance of each precious moment. That's why Thich Nhat Hanh has a book called Present Moment, Wonderful Moment. And he tells this story in one of his books. It's called Pieces Every Step. I use it in my classes. He tells the story of when he was 4 years old, and his mom came back from the bazaar with a cookie for him. So he went out into the yard of his house with his dog, one foot on the dog, one foot on the cat, and he enjoyed his cookie for 45 minutes. 4 years old, very precocious. So he really understood how to make the most of every moment, right? We might just, or a normal kid might just sort of devour the whole thing in a moment, but he dragged it out. He enjoyed it, the whole thing. That's quite remarkable. So all in all, of course, we want to live a kind and ethical life. I think all religious traditions would agree. If we live a kind and ethical life, we can sleep well at night and die without regret. So that would be the goal of our practice. Sleep well at night and die without regrets. Yeah? So by being ethical and kind, we won't have to fear our future, whatever it may be, whether we accept the idea of a future life or not. We can face it without fear. We read the obituaries. I really love to read the obituaries wherever I go, and to see how they comment on the value of people's lives. Some say nothing about, so-and-so died, age, birthplace, survivors, end of story. But many of them will tell how this person was remembered by their relatives and other survivors, what they've done for the community, how they benefited others, all the virtues that they embody. It's a great tribute when you read an obituary like that. Sometimes in my death and dying class, I ask the students to write their own obituaries. Yeah, it's very interesting. Out of a class of 25, I had 6 Nobel Prize winners. And so they will imagine their lives, even though they're young. They imagine the greatness that they're going to achieve in this life. It's good to have some goals, right? So in a sense, the pandemic is a disaster. We're surrounded with death on every side, and yet it's also a great reminder. We don't know if we'll be alive tomorrow. It sounds macabre, but it's really important to recognize, to live our lives as if each day were our last. Not in the sense of eat, drink, and be merry, but in the sense that each day is finally, crucially, immeasurably important. Yeah. So the topic of death is really urgent at the present moment. Now, dealing with the loss of our own death is one thing, but then dealing with the loss of our loved ones is another. And as much as we may meditate on death, it still comes as a shock somehow. When I heard that the abbot of the Burmese monastery in Bodh Gaya passed away, I just intuitively, my heart just broke. For me, it was like a real tragedy, because he was like a father to us all. He helped us in so many ways, and he lived a long life. But still, and so you could say, oh, well, time's up. But on the other hand, what we feel is the loss to ourselves, right? For the one who has died, it may be almost a sense of freedom from pain or something. But for us, it feels like a tragedy. Now, how do we explain that? The Buddhists would say that it's due to our attachment to our loved ones, our friends, our relatives, and so on. We feel pain when we lose them because we are attached to them. We miss them, right? In fact, they say the greater the attachment, the greater the suffering when we lose someone. Now then people will ask, well, what about love? Does that mean we don't love anyone? No, not at all. Love and attachment are two very different things. Mind you, love is often mixed with attachment, and attachment may also be mixed with love. So we may suffer from the attachment part, but we don't need to stop loving someone when they die. In fact, that's, I think, one of the most beautiful practices, is to send loving kindness to a person as they lay dying, and also after they pass away. We can continue. We don't stop loving people when they die, I mean, it's a natural thing. Dying is a natural part of life. And it's sad for us because we no longer have them by our side or by our phone. But on the other hand, we still love them. We can send them love wherever they may be. So I think that this helps to cope with loss and grief. And it's something that we should think about and hopefully practice. What are we still holding on to? What does it mean to grieve for someone for decades after they pass away? How can we handle the suffering that arises when we lose someone? But to replace attachment with pure love meaning love without attachment, love without expectations, right? So we need practices to learn to deal with grief and loss. And this is what the practice of metta or maitri, loving kindness for all living beings, but especially for those who are near and dear to us. So they say that only by reflecting on the meaning of death can we really understand life. And without this recognition, we waste our lives in petty pursuits, empty words, and start amassing objects. Thousands do, that we can't take with us. In this sense, I guess my father comes to mind because he was one who amassed material objects. Almost every year he'd have a new house, a new car, a new boat, a new airplane, and then he died. And all of his bank accounts and stock portfolios were absolutely meaningless at that time. And one moment, he actually said, I think I've wasted my life. I felt really happy that he had awakened to this realization that there was something more to life than all this accumulation of degrees and accomplishments and material objects. So I think he had a glimmer of insight there at the end. So maybe we can open up for questions. Do people have some questions?
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Venerable Lekshe. This has been touching at many points, especially some of the stories that you share, and to be in the present moment. We will actually open for questions. For all the guest listeners, welcome and thank you for co-creating this space. If you have any questions, or anyone watching live, if you have any questions, you can ask a question at ask at servicespace.org, or you can type your message in the live stream chat inbox. While people prepare and share questions, I wanted to maybe start with one of my own. 2 years ago, I lost my father as well, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I remember during those times, you would listen to these numbers. 10,000 people died here, 15,000 people died here. And they all continued to be a number up until the point that I lost my father. And it hit me suddenly that in those numbers, I could see my own father. It wasn't just my father alone. And I remember feeling this sense of subtle guilt because it was COVID and you're not able to see your family when they're gone. So while you are thinking of death in the way, but when it happens in a sudden way, when you're taken by shock and when you're overpowered with all these emotions of guilt, not doing enough, Not that that's true, it's a figment of mind, but it's still there. It's still present. How do you process that? So there's grief patched with guilt, patched with everything else that's forming in the process of shock. How do you support or how do you process through a wholesome growing so that you are not attached into a very false illusion of life or death in the process? So that's the question maybe we can start with.
It's a huge question. Of course, we want to live in a way that we support our loved ones before they pass away, so that in an ideal world, we would feel that we have done as much as we could to be there for them, to help them, to assure them that we love them, and so on. Of course, we all fail to meet our expectations, but we can try. And in the end, I think what we can console ourselves with is that we did our best. And if we tried our best, then that's wonderful. And we can rejoice in what we did well instead of mulling over and hitting ourselves over the head with our, shortcomings. Okay. So there's a natural tendency to sort of play up the negatives. And it's a bad habit of mind. And this is part of the Brahma Viharas that I showed you, the divine abidings. The one about rejoicing is also rejoicing in our own qualities and achievements and good deeds, basically our own good deeds. So if we can feel happy about what we did well, and then instead of wasting time, it's over. There's nothing we can do about it now. So what's the point? I found that the word for guilt is missing in many of the languages of the world. You don't find this word in Tibetan or Chinese or many African languages. You have a feeling of remorse or regret, but not this kind of guilt that you carry around with you. I think that's more of an Abrahamic conception, the sort of original sin idea, which the South Asian religious traditions don't have. So we all mess up, we all make mistakes, and we can regret, but we don't have to carry it around with us. So what's the point? It's an absolute waste of energy. Okay. So that I hope that might be helpful. And I'm very sorry for your loss. I think one thing we can do for sure is to support each other in our losses, to be there for them. And this is a sad point, is that often people don't know how to speak to the dying or to speak to those who have suffered a loss. But by meditating on death and impermanence, we get more comfortable with the realities of death. And then we can speak more naturally about it. How did you feel? Usually it's about listening, isn't it? I mean, how I hope you're not feeling too sad, and how can I help you? And if there's anything I can do, I'm here for you. And these sorts of things, we help each other out. Yeah. It's kind of bright. Any more questions?
Yes, thank you, Venerable Lekshe. Next question is from Carol, and she asks that would you please tell us about the various stages of dying and death and how we can accompany someone who is at the end of their life?
Okay, so well, there are many different ways to accompany someone at the end of their life. One thing that we should try to do is to understand them, their worldview, and not to impose a different worldview, especially when they're in a vulnerable state. It's a huge ethical issue. For example, here in the United States, there are many deathbed conversions, especially in the prisons. And so this is something I think we should avoid, right? For many reasons. So, yeah, but okay, so we can accompany a person with loving kindness. We can listen to them. We can listen to them and see how we can make them comfortable. Depending on their worldview, if we share their worldview, then we can counsel them according to that worldview. For example, if you're a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Christian, you can, and that's what I did. My mother was a Christian, Protestant, and she believed that she was going to heaven, and that God had built a mansion for her, and she was going to go and live in the mansion. Yeah, and she was very certain of it, and she actually died a very peaceful death. Sometimes, sometimes we talk about it, and I said, well, now, Mom, when you go to live in the mansion, what are you going to look like? Are you going to look like you look now? Or are you going to look a bit younger? And she says, younger. So cute. Yeah. So, and some Christians believe that they'll be 30 years old because that Jesus was 30 years old when he died. So people have different beliefs. And I think, whatever comfort we can offer them, we should offer according to their frame of reference. Meet people on their own terms, especially in the vulnerable condition of passing away. We don't want to, lay a trip on them, right? So now, as far as the stages of dying are concerned, this is particularly coming from the Buddhist tradition, specifically the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Not all Buddhists talk about these stages of dying. But according to the Tibetan schema, we dissolve in stages. We dissolve the aggregates of the body, the feelings, the recognitions, the mental formations, and consciousness dissolve in sequence. These are called the 5 aggregates, or 5 heaps of the human person. I suppose it would apply to dogs and cats too. I didn't ask that question, but humans, as human beings, we have awareness. So, and if we practice well in advance, we can actually guide our consciousness through these stages. So, for example, when the earth element dissolves, it correlates with the body, the aggregate of the body, the form aggregate, and we feel very heavy. We feel like we're sinking into the earth, right? And there's certain signs, both internal signs and external signs, that go along with this dissolution of the earth element. Then next, you'd have the dissolution of the water element. And there would be signs that go along with that. Your mouth feels dry and your skin dries up and these sorts of things. And then you see certain visions, like some maybe a blue smoke or something, and because you've practiced in advance, you know what to expect. Now, what they talk about in the so-called Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is not its real title, is that you may also see fearful sorts of forms, apparitions. And of course, we have lots of things in our head, especially if we watch those scary movies, I mean, this is one thing to think about when we talk about how to live in order to die well. Think about what we put into our consciousness. People watch what they call action movies, but in fact, they are violent. And so people are putting all of these fearful, scary images and violent images into their heads. Well, garbage in, garbage out. We have to be aware that these images influence our consciousness. I'm not saying that we all have to just hang out in sweetness and light. We can if we want to, but we don't want to avoid the realities of life, but we also want to be very conscious of what we put in our minds, right? So in any case, sometimes during this transition process, people will see scary images, but the idea is to, if you've meditated well, to see them, they're all just products of the mind. They're not external objects. They're just constructions of the mind, and then we can get over our fears. We don't want to die in fear. We don't want to die in anger. We don't want to die in hatred. We want to die mindfully, with equanimity, right? So this is just in brief. We could do a whole weekend workshop on this topic. We can.
Thank you. I would like to invite Jasmine to offer a question.
Thank you. Thank you for your clarification and your presentation. I have a different viewpoint in your presentation. So I used to work in a healthcare system, and as early as I remember, people will reach out to me and ask me permission to leave. The first time someone called me and said, "Miss, I'm ready to go," I was stunned and asked her why she choosing me. She told me she was comfortable in doing so. I asked her if it was okay. She said yes. So I said, "You have my permission." I left work, and then 2 hours later, they called me. They told me she peacefully left. And that continue in different area. I will go visit people at home, and they call me aside and said, "I'm really ready, but my family is not." Again, I will confer with them and asking them if they're ready. Once they tell me, I'm like, okay. Sometimes I make referral for hospice or different things for them. Mm-hmm. Recently, I had a very good friend who also was in her last day, a very short illness. She called me and said she's ready to go, but her husband is not. And again, I spoke with her and she said she is fine. My issue is, I understand my friends or people, my patients, they are ready to go and I support them. But I always felt a bit almost guilty, almost like I'm depriving their family. One way I know they are their own entity and they're ready. But it's almost like I feel like I'm in a club. It's like a secret thing. They ready to go, they go. And I know they feel okay. How do I separate that and understand it's for them, not for the family? Or do I need to share? I had never shared with their family what they tell me. But I guess on the human side, I feel a little bit guilty because they left. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your experience. It's very valuable. The experience of healthcare providers, of course, is on the ground. And I appreciate your good work, sincerely from my heart, and of all the healthcare workers who are being with the dying. It's a great privilege. And as you mentioned, also a responsibility. I don't think that you should feel guilty at all. That, as you say, these patients are their own entities. When they're ready to go, it's their right to go. And this has become a big issue in hospice care and end-of-life care, that sometimes the family will keep the person alive when it's really time for them to go. And often the treatments are very painful, and often they're useless also. So that where they're keeping people alive, they're prolonging the dying rather than prolonging the living. So I think that now we're talking about a natural death here, and death is a natural thing. We're not talking about artificially shortening their life. So there is no reason to feel guilty. You should feel happy that you had the privilege of sharing this important moment with the patients. and being there for them at that amazing, amazing time. Thank you.
Thank you, Venerable Lekshe. And next question is from an online listener, and he's saying that I am 56, I am single, and I have no kids, and I have a fear of dying. So, do you have any suggestions for me? And I think just to couple that, there's also another question from Lee, I think, which sort of builds upon that. And Lee asks, how should we live in order to die well? So if you could share a few thoughts on
Okay,
both.
right. Well, so I think that these two questions do fit together. If we've lived well, we should have no reason to fear death. So the way we live well is to live an ethical life, right? Keep basic ethical principles, practice generosity to our loved ones and to the poor, to be patient, right? And to be kind, compassionate, and do some spiritual practice, whatever that means for you. Now, meditation is a great one because it helps us to understand our own minds. So from the Buddhists do several different kinds of meditation, as I may have mentioned, maybe I didn't, but there is single pointed concentration, and then there's insight meditation, right? So both are valuable. So for insight meditation, we want to understand the true nature of life, true nature of our minds. So there's a lot that we can explore to understand, what are we afraid of? We're afraid, yeah, they would leave it an open question. I don't want to give away, spoiler alert, but they would leave it to the practitioner to explore, what is it that you're afraid of? Are you afraid of the pain? Some are afraid of the pain or suffering of the physical deterioration. And of course, that is a factor. But being afraid of the pain doesn't help the pain. It may even make it worse, right? So usually the question is that we're afraid of losing ourself. We're attached to ourself, and we don't want to give up ourself. But that is really based on a misunderstanding of the nature of the self. Whether we take the sort of let's call Hindu view of the Atman, the real self, or the Buddhist view of no self. Either way, attachment to it doesn't do any good at all. It's a distortion of the reality, right? So we get into the philosophy of it, but there are also other practical solutions. Making a friend circle. Now they're doing circles of dying, so that people get together and talk about it. Just the sheer notion of talking about dying, which previously was a taboo topic. As I mentioned, you don't mention it in polite company. But now, say the San Francisco Hospice Project, they really encourage this. Let's talk about it, right? Because we fear the unknown. And if we can get more familiar with the concept of dying and different concepts of how to die, and this will help to allay our fears. So these questions go hand in hand. But preparing for dying means we need to know more about dying. What does it mean? How can we handle it? What are the possible solutions? There are hundreds of books out. So this is all good information, right? Then we can make up our own minds.
Thank you, Venerable Lekshe. I'd like to next invite one of our guest listeners, Haya Messinger, on call to ask the next question.
Would like to extend my gratitude to be invited to this space. I know many people here and very enlightened, like Marlene, Nipun, Ruby, I'm very Rona, Magna, everyone is so enlightened. So I hope I won't take unnecessarily time. I have actually different question, even though I submitted another one. I have a friend that her mom had car accident. As outcome of that, she became more withdrawn. She lost connection also from other losses, like people die on her. And now she decided to to end her life. And I would like to know, in terms of advice, how can I support this friend? It's very emotionally for me, because I understand you need to respect the person, but I know how it also will upset my friend as well. So if you can bring some input from your experience, I would be very thankful for that.
Well, the question you pose is a very difficult one, a very delicate one, in fact, because on one hand, people should have the right to make their own decisions. On the other hand, most religious traditions believe that we should protect life and not end life artificially. That death should come in its natural process. It comes to everyone. And in ancient India, it came to people. I mean, it was just an accepted part of life, right? So but that's a bit different than intentionally taking one's life. So I think that you would have to handle the situation very carefully. And get to know her view. Listen, or your friend can listen carefully to why the mother is thinking about this option. You see? So, in fact, from a Buddhist point of view, taking a life is a very serious matter. It's considered an unwholesome action. And especially to take a human life is considered an unwholesome action. At the same time, we know that a lot of people in the last stages of their life simply stop taking food, as many animals just stop taking food. It becomes very painful to digest, and they just sort of naturally pass away that way. But listening is a really important, not to sort of imposing one's own position on the person. It's a difficult thing, but in the end, they find that for example, in Belgium, where termination of one's own life has been legal since the 80s. But they find that the people who make this decision usually make it not because of fear of pain, but because they feel useless. They feel that their life has no meaning. They don't want to be a burden on others. So more than 80% of them fall in this category. Now, we can do a lot on that level to make the person feel valued, to make the person feel loved, to help them create meaning in their life, whatever that may mean for them, right? Let them know that they're supported, right? So, whatever the question, love is the answer. So this is something very realistic and practical that we can do. Understanding and love.
Thank you, Venerable Lekshe. Our next questioner asks, my brother had just got a street puppy at home, but one evening I was driving back from work and he accidentally came under my car wheels. Since then, I haven't been able to overcome my guilt. How do I process this?
Oh, well, actions depend on one's intention. And if we don't have the intention to harm, then the action is not as serious. It's not serious. Of course, we can't say that this is not a serious matter. Of course, it is. But because there was no intention to harm, there's really nothing to feel guilty about. Rather than feeling guilty, we could put our energy into helping the person in whatever ways we can. Whether they're still living, we can help with healthcare, we can help with daily needs. If they passed away, we can also offer prayers and send good thoughts in this way. But again, carrying around the guilt doesn't help us, and it doesn't help the other person. So I would recommend that we just put that aside and deal with the situation moment to moment. Yeah, do the best we can under the circumstances. Okay. I know that's easier said than done, but the alternative is not favorable. To always be crushed by guilt. It doesn't help the person, it doesn't help us. So yeah. I'm very sorry to hear about this.
Thank you, Honorable Lekshe, and thank you even to the person who asked that question and to everyone who are bringing such, heartfelt and very sincere questions. It is just such a gift to be able to be in this space and to, I think, reflect together on this. Thank you so much. Next question is from Karthikeni, and she asks that shouldn't we all be introduced and talked about death from childhood itself to be a better person? If yes, then how and where do we start from?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is actually a very good suggestion. I think that we should be introduced to the concept of death from an early age, so that it isn't such a scary and frightening sort of thing for everyone. There are many books now that try to introduce the topic to children because, as we know, people don't all die when they're old. Many people die when they're in prime of life, or as youth, or as teenager, as child, even as a very young child. So often I'm called into the hospitals to talk with counselors who deal with the children in Children's Hospital where they're facing life-threatening illnesses and so on, and the parents too, because it's a serious matter for the parents also. So you may get some tips from the books that are out, and also even just asking the question, what is death? It's rather touching. Some young children are introduced to the topic when their pets pass away. But unfortunately, there's also a trend in the United States to terminate the lives of pets who are sick. So I think that it's kind of sad to my mind. Whereas if the animals just pass away naturally, of course, it's never easy, but it's also more natural. And then children come to accept, like children who grow up on a farm, for example, they learn to accept that death is a natural part of life. And it's not necessarily a tragedy. That's the question. Is death a tragedy? Necessarily a tragedy? Well, not necessarily. It may just be the normal course of events, right? So talking with children about it, and not lying. I think it's better not to say, oh, grandma went to Fairyland or Disneyland or whatever. I mean, I think we should, in a gentle way, introduce children to the realities of life. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Next.
Well, and here I might say also, those religious traditions that accept the existence of an afterlife, maybe it's a bit easier in a way, that it's not necessarily the end. Death is not necessarily the end, a final cessation, because there are other possibilities, other states of existence, and we learn from what we learn in this lifetime, and then according to our actions, we will take another existence. It's one way. In those cultures that accept this worldview, then it may be a bit easier.
Thank you. And there's one more question around suicide. It is by Ellie, and she says that my 21-year-old nephew died from suicide 2 months ago, and our family is devastated right now. Uh, have you any suggestions on how to comfort someone in the aftermath of a situation like this?
Did you say that the child was 11 years old?
21.
21. Okay. A suicide is a very sad event in any family, in any community. I think we have to just recognize that. And it's also obvious that the family would be devastated. And even if there were indications that the young man was depressed or feeling, unhappy in life, it would still come as a terrible shock to the family. I think what we have to be careful of is assigning blame, either to ourselves or to anyone else, because in a case like this, it depends on the circumstances, of course. Sometimes substances are involved, for example. Sometimes bullying is involved. So it really have to take it on a case-by-case situation. I feel that the increased incidence of suicide among young people throughout the world, it's really become a kind of epidemic. And we really have to deal with it seriously. We all need to try to find ways to help young people to find meaning in their life, and to and help them out with whatever problems they may be having, to prevent this very sad increase in the incidence of suicide. Even it's down to preteens, no? But a lot of it, unfortunately, is due to social media, expectations of body image, and things like this. So in this way, hopefully we can help young people, especially young women, feel okay with their appearance. It would be too sad to end one's life by feeling that they're not beautiful enough or something like that. And there's some of it is also, I'm sorry to say that some companies actually play on these ideas of body image, selling cosmetics to 8-year-olds. It doesn't make any kind of sense. So there's a lot of work to be done in helping the young people that we know, being friends with them, helping introduce them to natural, to nature and other pursuits that will be more meaningful in their lives. So something like that. Yeah. I'm very sorry to hear about this. Really, every time I hear it, I feel sad. So yeah, we can all try to help as best we can. Being kind, right? Being kind, even being kind to a young person may offset some bullying or unkindness that they've experienced. We never know how we touch people, One word, one smile can make such a huge difference in a person's life, enveloping them, even if it's just a mental projection, enveloping them in a sort of an aura of love. It can help. It can help. Yeah.
Thank you, Venerable Lekshe. This has been a pretty recent unfolding around my neighborhood as well. So thank you for answering that question. We have another question from a reader. How do we deal with the uncertainty of death?
Okay. The uncertainty of death, this is a slightly easier question. The uncertainty of death is that we should always be prepared. So we can be prepared by this meditation on impermanence, getting in touch with the impermanence of our own body and mind. When we do this, it's very clear that all the molecules, all the cells of our body, we're just a big swarming mass of neutrons and protons and electrons. There's nothing stable about our bodies at all. In fact, we're disintegrating moment to moment. So when we get closely in touch with that reality, then we recognize that death can come at any time. So no surprises.
Thank you. So one more question from George, and he asks that are the countless near-death experience reports, medium research reports, reincarnation research, and other scientific research compatible with the Buddhist teachings about bardos?
Oh, okay. Well, the near-death experiences are not real death experiences. So according to my teachers, they don't really fall into the topic of death because they come back. They didn't die. So they may have seen a tunnel. They may have seen a light. That's what they report. But it doesn't necessarily follow that this is something that we would necessarily see when we die. So there are many reports of rebirth, and I think some of these can really be taken seriously. Ian Stevenson's research on rebirth, I think it's 60 cases indicative of rebirth. Plus, in India, there are countless stories of young children who remember their past lives, and many of them have been documented. So I know of several cases where they even took the young child to Dharamsala to meet with His Holiness Dalai Lama, because the children had remembered the names of their parents, the name of the street where they lived, the name of their primary school. They could find their school books. They knew the names of their siblings from the previous lifetime and so forth. So this is all, I think, believable. I mean, it's we have some evidence, in other words, for rebirth. But these children remember when they're very young, and then gradually they lose the ability to see into their past lives. Now, that's not the end of the story, though, because with meditation, it's possible to see one's previous lifetimes. It makes sense in a way, because if our consciousness is a single stream of conscious moments, right, then it would be possible to trace it back to an earlier time. Just like we may or may not remember what happened yesterday, or 10 years ago, or when we were a young child, or when we were, some could even push it back to remember the time of birth. And then push it back even to remember the time of conception. And of course, if we can remember the moment of conception, it's only one moment to the last moment of the previous lifetime. So they say that in meditation, this is possible. It's not unusual to remember one's previous 7 rebirths. They say it's not that difficult, but it should be done under proper guidance. So, and it's not just to, announce to the world that you were Napoleon or Cleopatra or something like that. There's so many people who claim to have been Cleopatra or Napoleon or something. That's not the point. In fact, if we see our previous lifetimes, we have to be ready for what we see, because we haven't always been nice people. We've been murderers, we've been torturers, we've been thieves, and worse. And so the point would be to get an understanding of the wheel of life and the workings of cause and effect. Right now, we might think, oh, well, if I do something bad, will it really have any consequence or not? Well, if we could see our past lives, we would definitely know that there are consequences to our actions. And that would be the takeaway. Not to say, oh, I was so and such, because we've all been, according to South Asian religious traditions, we've all been born countless times, again and again, since beginningless time. That would be virtually infinite rebirths. And we've been we've been human beings, we've been animals, we've been gods, we've been hungry ghosts, we've been hell beings, innumerable times. And we still haven't learned our lesson. But the human rebirth is the top of the line. This is as good as it gets, because now we have the intelligence to see the pattern of cause and effect, and how we can affect a positive rebirth, and how we can avoid an unfortunate rebirth. Through wholesome actions, we can pretty much be assured of a fortunate rebirth. Through dastardly deeds, we can pretty much be assured of an unfortunate rebirth. So that's the general pattern, eh?
Thank you. We are almost at the end of our time, but many questions are still coming in. So probably we'll maybe stretch 5 minutes over and just take a couple more questions to end with. So whenever Lekshe, next question is from Pallavi. And she says that I could not speak to my father as he passed away on the hospital bed. I reached in time, but I never got to say goodbye. And I regret this every day, and I keep thinking about this. And I regret it, and I'm also concerned that will this cause pain to my dad wherever he is, and how should I get over this and be at peace myself?
Okay. Well, I'm very sorry to hear this experience, and it must be quite painful to not have a chance to say goodbye. And this is actually an experience that's happening to millions of people around the world during this time. So it's really an important question. Of course, there is no blame here, because according to the hospital regulations, people are not allowed in to see the dying patients often because of the risk of infection. So the whole idea is to protect life, and certainly not to harm people and make them miserable by separating them from their loved ones as they lay dying. The reality is that people are really having a hard time. But I certainly don't think you should feel guilty or responsible that you have caused pain to your father, because your father would have been actually busy with his process of dying. And ideally, he would also be sending loving kindness to his family members. And you, from your side, would also be sending loving kindness to him. And so we do the best under the circumstances. We cannot always control the circumstances, but we can control how we deal with the circumstances, right? So again, feelings of guilt are, in a sense, wasted energy, because we cannot change the past, and we're not in control of this pandemic. It's unprecedented event, and it's extremely sad. But psychologically, what we can do is keep love in our hearts for those that have passed away, and for those who are still living. You see, now if we were to get so miserable about having missed this opportunity, well, that might sort of take up energy that we could use to those who survived. So the love that we have, the energy that we now should use to help those who are still with us. And then this would be a really good solution, I think.
Thank you. And I think just to close our call, one final question, I think, which is something which Many listeners have asked already in slightly different forms. Taz has asked it, Sheetal has asked it, Michael has asked it, and perhaps I think that's a great way to bookend our gathering today, to offer, some closing remarks from your side as we close this conversation. And they say that, uh, what do you recommend we do to make the most of each day we are alive? There are always forces pulling us in different directions, including our minds. Where should we focus our time and energy?
Mhm. Well, personally, I believe that we should focus our energy on cultivating our minds, so that we can evolve spiritually, purify our minds of all unwholesome impulses, try to purify our minds of greed, hatred, ignorance, and so forth, jealousy, pride, and all of that. And this will help in every way. It will help in every situation. See, we cannot be the best caregiver if we are tormented by, all kinds of anger and hatred and, feelings of lacking self-worth and all of that. What we want to do is to replace those unhappy feelings, and they're rather, useless worries and distractions. Replace them with positive traits such as compassion, loving kindness, wisdom. And in this way, we can be not only in the best mental state that we can be in, but we'll also be in a mental state where we can help others. This is the thing, if we're so depressed, if we're so, if we're so dispirited, then we're not really in the best form to help others. So we want to be in our best possible state, full of love and compassion for others, so we can become a resource for others. We're a help to the world, and the world needs people with this kind of positive attitude, as much as possible, and then we can really feel good about our day, every day, day to day. Now, of course, there are also many practical actions. In addition to purifying our own mind through meditation, study, chanting, whatever, we can also do helpful actions like feeding the poor, feeding those in need, trying to provide medical equipment. Maybe we can help with childcare. Whatever we can do to help others, we should try to do it, but safely, of course, right? Keeping with mask distance, but still do what we can. And, every little bit counts. Really, providing these ration supply bags for the disadvantaged, this is a great contribution. I think I rejoice. And that's another thing we can do, is rejoice in the good qualities and good actions of others. This helps to create a happy mind. So instead of being depressed, we feel good about whatever positive actions we can do, and do as many as we can, and then rejoice. So every day we feel joy. We increase our joy, our understanding, our compassion. I will try to do likewise, and I encourage you all. Yes, I thank everyone who's helped make this program possible. And I appreciate everyone who has come to discuss the topic. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Venerable Lekshe. It's been such an honor to listen to you. As we close out our call, can we request you to please offer us a chant before we go?
Sure. Okay, so in the Buddhist tradition, we have a custom of rejoicing in the merit. It means that of all the places we could have been just now, and all of the activities we could have engaged in, we chose to come to talk about this vital matter of death and dying. And so by listening to these words and to people's questions and thinking through these issues, we've created a lot of merit. And so we want to share the merit of our practice, of our discussions with others. So this is the meaning of the prayer. Gewadinududa Lama Sange Tugyuni Dowachika Malu Eki Sala By virtue of the merit that we have accumulated, may we achieve the state of perfect awakening in order to liberate all living beings from suffering, leaving not one behind. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to invite everyone to just hold a moment of silence for all that have been present with us on this call in physical and in our spirits. And we will continue to stay together in this journey to cultivate together. Thank you. Just holding a minute of silence.